We have a full house here this afternoon, which is good. It shows the interest in the region and the topic. So we're going to cover a lot of topics, as we just heard. We're going to start, open our apertures wide and start at the macro level, then work our way down to more industry and technology specific issues. So with that, and just coming on the heels of what was an excellent trade panel, seems like trade dominates so many of our conversations. Why don't we start with the geopolitics and how you see geopolitical tensions in the C-suite. It's called a C-suite session. In the boardrooms, how does it affect your businesses? And personally, how do you think geopolitical tensions are affecting consumer sentiment and investor sentiment? Why don't we start with Ed, and then we'll go to Ben.
Yeah, it's been very tough in Asia because the Sino-US trade relations, of course, is causing a lot of tension. If you look at deleveraging, it started the second half of last year. We saw a fair bit of deleveraging on investment, and we saw actually a very gradual build-up in cash. Right through to last month, the cash built up year on year has increased by about 2 percentage points, and we see that continuing to go up. Now, fragmentation, protectionism is actually very bad for business. But in Asia, when you dissect that further as well, there are also opportunities for growth in countries like Vietnam, for example. Foxtron, the largest manufacturer for Apple iPhone, for example, has gone to India. So whilst you're looking at all this complexity, don't look at Asia as one cluster. Pick your winners. There are still a lot of opportunities around Asia. And Asians, typically, the last 4 elections across Australia, Thailand, Indonesia, and India, they have actually chosen the incumbents to stay on. So they have voted for stability in Asia. And this is actually a pretty good trend for Asia. Indonesia, for example, President Jokowi, I think will attract a fair bit more FDI, foreign direct investment, and also his policy on oil and gas, moving decidedly into more sustainable investment area. I think that bodes well for the region. Thailand, with the return of Prime Minister Prayut as well, under, of course, very stressed conditions. But I think the GDP growth under the 2036 strategic vision of 5 to 6% GDP, or doubling the GDP per capita by 2 times in 25 years, I think those will build very well for Thailand as well. So I see stability in Asia despite all these complexities. But I think since we are in this forum, regulators have to work with the politicians better as well to prevent more carve-out or ring-fencing of liquidity and capital, right, which for banks have been very difficult. So in a nutshell, Asians are cautiously optimistic despite the very tough situation with Brexit and Sino-US relations. And I, for one, in managing the money across Asia, I'm talking to most of the families. They're entrepreneurs, they are used to it, they trade pretty well, and they are actually looking more for opportunities at the right level to invest rather than being very pessimistic about it. So it's kind of an oxymoron. It's tough, but it's opportunistic.
You sound optimistic. Stability, you mentioned, if only the tensions, maybe politicians would turn off their Twitter feeds, it might be, we might improve conditions. Ben, how do you assess what he just said, and do you share those thoughts?
I do. I share the thoughts in terms of, I think the outlook is incredibly positive, and I think we have to be careful not to conflate the politics and the media story with actually what's going on in business. The flow of capital out of Asia to the rest of the world and around Asia has never been as strong. Trade with many countries has never been as strong. And I think, and therefore the capital available to make investments in Asia is very significant. There's not enough investment opportunities actually for those flows of capital at the moment, which I think is one of the biggest challenges for capital looking for deployment today. So I do think it's, the most often question I get asked at the moment, certainly in the last 6 months, is what do you think will happen with the trade war? And I always think to myself, I hope the other people know the answer to that question, because I don't think anyone knows, and I certainly don't know because it sort of changes with every tweet on a daily basis. And I think that's the point. I think a lot of it is just noise. The fundamentals of large parts of Asia remain very strong. Yes, in some big markets like China, we've had issues, the challenges of deleveraging or currency controls, but actually FDI into a lot of countries, whether it be India or Indonesia, have never been as strong. The capital in North Asia, whether it be in Korea or Japan, is increasingly international and looking for deployment outside its own market, and that's, I think, a very positive thing for business. So I think, all in all, the trade wars or tensions is taking some confidence out of the system and the market, but is it really disrupting business? I don't think so. I think those two are still separate in terms of the politics and business.
So filter out the noise, focus on the fundamentals. The fundamentals are good. The region is optimistic. Now, you bring a unique perspective as chair of the U.S. ASEAN Business Council. How do you see some of these issues with specific reference to the region?
I agree with the perspective that the basic fundamentals are in favor of growth, and the basic fundamentals are in favor of a good investment environment for a very long horizon. Wearing my EU ASEAN Business Council hat, every year we do a survey of European businesses throughout the region, the ASEAN region, and 99% of the last survey said that they are going to maintain or expand their level of employment and operational presence in the region. So it can't get much better than that. 51% said they saw that region as the best region of opportunity. Now, of course, it's biased because there are people playing in that region. But the countries that Edmund and Ben refer to, you refer to Indonesia, Thailand. I was in Cambodia last week. I mean, there are extraordinary dynamics in play that ought to drive a continuous growth in trade and investment. You have 60 million increase in working population between 2015 and 2030. So we're not talking about a long time. It's rapidly increasing. During that same period of time, 80 million new middle-class households and 100 million people will move into cities in ASEAN. So that creates enormous needs for infrastructure of every kind, for corporate investment of every kind, and should drive dynamics. Now, in the short term, as Ben said, I'm glad you didn't ask what's going to happen in the trade situation, because obviously we've had every panel today has discussed it. Nobody knows. The biggest concern, I guess, and the last panel focused in on this a bit, which is if the news flow and the actual direct effect of tariffs is probably pretty minor based on most economic analysis, but if the news flow and the sentiment start to shift more to draw more conservatism into investment in general, the consumers pull back more cash, meaning not just from an investment perspective, but from a consumption perspective, an overall slowing is not good for anybody's growth dynamics. But medium, long term, I think all the indications are positive.
Great, and I'm glad you mentioned infrastructure. We're going to come back to infrastructure. You know a lot about infrastructure down there. We're going to come back to that in just a moment as we work our way into more industry specific. Let me turn to Tokyo and our Japan institution. I know, Oko-san, you have a slide that you'd like to show. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you see the future of the regional integration and the perspective of the region from here in Tokyo.
Okay. I believe no one in this room doubts the potential growth of Asia-Pacific region, but let me show you visually. Please see the slide, world population and the GDP, now and 2040. This slide clearly shows the bright future for the Asian-Pacific region. Japan is located in the north of the Asia-Pacific region, and Japan needs to live by utilizing the hot growth of the region. Having said that, the Asian-Pacific region hasn't materialized its fully growth potential yet. And in order for region to grow fully, it is necessary, at least, to lower geopolitical risks and develop an environment which the inflow of foreign investment money From geopolitical perspectives, Japan is a member of both RCEP and TPP-11, plus US, hopefully. This means that Japan has a very important role and close relationship both with US and China. However, there are many issues to work on, such as the framework to warrant the freedom of navigation and trade, or as well as rule making of data use and protection. There are also issues criticized amid expansion of OBOR, One Belt, One Road initiatives, such as spreading dictatorship or death trap. They are in the scope of free and open Indo-Pacific region, which Prime Minister Abe advocates for. I think the future of the regional integration lies ahead in the multipolar network model by all nations in the nation, instead of the hub and spokes networks centered or be enclosed by the China or the US. US-China tension, as all of us recognize, have deep roots and long-time issues. I hope, however, all nations in the region turn this tough situation into the opportunity for developing the multipolar relationship. Each nation, in the meanwhile, needs to develop bankable environments, such as a better governmental procedure, or the legal and tax system, or as well as fiscal and political stability, which all are vital to bring into stable foreign investment money. Norin Chukin Bank is looking forward to this region's growth as an investment opportunity for our Japanese yen, as well as a market for high-quality Japanese food, as well as a tourist opportunity to offer inbound customers Japanese sites and cultural experiences. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Let's turn the conversation upside down a bit for a moment. Mustafa, you are in the technology business. You're a technology expert. You're focused on AI. Maybe you could describe a little bit about the regional approach to technology, acceptance to technology. How important is technology with respect to the future growth of the region, especially with respect to the use of AI?
I think I want to step back a little bit about the role of ASEAN in this geopolitical tension that's happening right now. And certainly, I think there are many challenges affecting ASEAN as a region. First of all, it's definitely the divide between demographic shift. Some of the economies like Thailand, Singapore, and I think Malaysia eventually is approaching an aging population, aging society, while others are growing very, very fast. This leads to, and also within the economy itself, the social issue because of income gap, and also the infrastructure readiness in some of the countries, that there's a lot of disparities between these countries and disconnectedness. But so given the high-tempo geopolitical tension in many fronts, there are two areas that I think ASEAN can prioritize to better immune themselves against this change in the economic environment. So the first one I would want to address is the economic integration and connectivity within the region itself. This is going to be important because it's maximized our potential as an exporting hub. ASEAN can stand to gain from the attempt of the MNC that's tried to diversify away from China as the tension escalates. But moreover, a better integration would allow us to tap the full power of the demand of this 650 million population market. But a lot of integration that we had discussed so far involve around goods and services, capital and labor, but much less topic has been discussed around data flow. And to facilitate this, I think a lot of the major issue needs to be tackled, such as the private information protection, intellectual property rights protection, and such harmonized standards will definitely require and concerted efforts among all the enforcement in the region. The second priority that I would like to highlight is also ASEAN is lacking behind in terms of technology adoption and digital literacy. Every day, we are projecting to see about 125,000 new users coming online every day throughout, now until 2020. But some of the barrier of integration could be resolved by technology. For example, the translation app can tackle the language barrier. The online courses can bring inclusive education to your home. But the problem is rather the technology adoption, which research show that it highly coincides with education. And also the lack of digital literacy, despite we have increasing access to smartphone, I think consumers are not fully aware of the dangers from being connected. And that would we start to see a lot of case of frauds like phone call scans, phishing emails, and also, let alone the awareness on the data protection on their own privacy. So I think this is the increasing digital literacy will definitely immune themselves against all these dangers.
Thank you. You raised two important issues. Maybe we take both of them, and I'm going to open it up. One is on demographics. You have, in a sense, the two different stories going on here. You have some population, some countries where we have a quickly, rapidly aging population. The percentage of citizens over the age of 65 is occurring quickly. We're going to have a graying population. Maybe in some instances where you grow old before you grow rich. In other countries, you have an emerging young population. And to your point, do we have the skill sets necessary not to go from rural areas to working in traditional manufacturing, the cycle that we've seen in previous countries in the region, but making that quantum jump to more services or technology oriented? So it's a question of how do all of you think about the demographics generally? How do you manage and plan for an aging population? And do you see the skill sets, the human capital among young cohorts to take advantage of a high-tech or technology-oriented economy? And I open up to any of you, Don.
I'll go.
Okay.
I live in this world coming from a background of an insurance guy for a very long time. So you've described it really well. And the way I put it, when you've got young populations, but you're approaching aging very fast, you have to fund the graying and the growing at the same time. So to put it in perspective, we're in Japan. Japan took 21 years to go from a young country, meaning 10% of the population over 65, to what's considered an aging country, 20% over 65. Now, Japan did that over that 20-some years over a long period of time. Thailand is going to make that journey in about 18 years, starting in 2013. So aging much faster. That's a combination of mortalities and getting better, birth rates are falling, et cetera. So Japan, by the time it reached that level, already had a big pension system. It already had a big insurance system. It already had a functioning capital market. Thailand actually is doing relatively well in the ASEAN setting at that. But still, if you add insurance, pension, and mutual fund assets together, they're 57% of GDP in Thailand. Japan is like 125. US and UK are both over 250. So there's still a lot of gap to close in terms of building up the pension, the longer term end of the spectrum. You think that Indonesia doesn't have that problem or Cambodia doesn't have that problem. Actually, the percentage increase in people over 65 is rapidly increasing there as well. And they even have lower penetration rates of these long-term saving institutions. So that's the getting ready for the grain. How do you fund all this? I mean, we'll come back to infrastructure, bat the ball back to Ben in a minute. But in order to fund long-term capital for infrastructure, permanent capital for corporations, you need to be able to put money to work for 10, 20, 30 years. What sector of society is going to do that? The banking sector is short and medium term. It can't do that. So every country in the region has to work much more quickly to get its capital markets more robust, more liquid, and to move the money from the banks or the mattresses or wherever it has to be short term into these long-term institutions if it's going to fund graying and growing. So it's an urgent priority. Some countries are, as I said, Thailand is further along. The same ratio, I said 57 in Thailand, is 11 in Indonesia.
A great point. I'll quickly go to you, Ben, since we were talking about infrastructure. Where is the financing, where is the capital for the acute infrastructure needs we see globally, but certainly in the region? To Don's point about the need to intermediate savings into long-term investment, 30, 40-year horizons, very tough for banks to make those investments. Where's the capital coming from, and is there sufficient resources?
So it depends which market you're looking at, but the simple answer is Asia needs $75 trillion of infrastructure capital over the next 20 years, and at the moment we can only see, as we look out, funding for about 50% of that. So to Don's point, there is a big funding gap. And if you think about it, in a world that's very long capital, you've got a huge amount of capital looking for deployment, and you've got the need to fund a lot of assets. You would think it would be simple to put those two things together and enable the funding of infrastructure and the building of infrastructure. And depending on what market you go to, it differs quite significantly. And one of the issues in some markets, we have governments that have very strong balance sheets with strong local institutions. And generally the best investors in infrastructure, which is a local asset class, it's normally within one jurisdiction, one border, the best funders of those is normally local capital, along with things like local capital markets and also the government. And we see that occurring particularly in North Asia. If we look at ASEAN, you've got a lot of economies that don't have government balance sheets that actually can fund their infrastructure build out, but at the moment they are struggling to access capital that isn't multilateral capital because they actually don't have a real proof of concept yet that there is adequate risk sharing between the private and public sector. And so I think what we'll see is when markets, whether it be Vietnam or Cambodia or Indonesia, are actually able to prove to the big institutions like the pension funds and sovereign wealth funds that people can deploy capital over the medium term and get the right return back and do it with confidence. When they have proof of concept, the capital will move into those markets very quickly, just like it did in places like Korea and China, some 10 or 15 years ago. But the issue at the moment is we just don't have the regulatory frameworks in place that are enabling that. And so I think that is really the thing that will change the flows of capital into infrastructure, particularly in ASEAN where there is the biggest need.
To your point, is there any one country, or can you cite a country or two that you think does it right, that is a model for everyone else?
Yeah. So I think the best example is South Korea. So after the currency crisis in the late 90s, the government wanted to reposition the economy to be much more dynamic and export focused. It realised that it just didn't have the balance sheet to fund the building of bridges, the building of energy and so on. And so it introduced a whole range of very sophisticated concession arrangements where private capital was guaranteed a minimum return, but where there was outperformance, the government would share the upside. So you knew if you were a pension fund in Korea or Japan or Australia or an insurance company in the US or Europe, that you were essentially going to get a minimum 8% return, and that was essentially government credit, but you also had the upside. So at a time when people were wary about the Korean economy, where it was coming off some very troublesome years, it put in place this program. And what we saw was a very rapid build out of bridges and roads, tunnels, subway and energy capacity. And as a consequence, there was so much confidence built up around that market that the government in the wave 2 of that program provides no minimum revenue guarantees because it doesn't have to, because it's created proof of concept and there's now more capital, both domestic and international capital, than there are projects. And so that, I think, is a great model in terms of a country trying to reposition itself in terms of thinking about how it's going to deal with becoming a middle-income economy and what it needs to do to enable that, and a way to draw in capital and create confidence. And I think that's the model, with some sort of, a local overlay that we need to see introduced in places like Indonesia, Vietnam, and particularly places like Thailand, where actually you have a liquid market. That capital can't go outside its own borders,
Right.
and yet it doesn't have projects to allocate to because it can't deal with the risk at the
Right,
moment.
you do have savings that just needs to be intermediated domestically. You just need the instrumentality, you need the projects, and as you said, some sort of public policy component that can address some of the risk, either perceived risk or actual risk. Oka-san or Ed, what about you? What are your thoughts on either demographics or the need for infrastructure?
Yeah, when you guys were having that conversation, I was just having this recollection many years ago when we say you live older and longer. So we developed the financial planning tool with all the data points and all the permutation. And it was kind of funny when you put it to real test to someone that is 55, which is obviously too old to plan for retirement. You should start earlier. So we went through the whole scheme and say, I'm by nature very conservative. We say, okay, these are the instruments. I have only 100,000 to start. We say, fine. And your regular savings plan every month is another $10,000. That's fine. But I'll require 25,000 a month to sustain my lifestyle when I'm 65. When we did the permutation, we say, well, you have two options. You have to die earlier at 75, or you got to start saving more. Now, the truth is, I find that whilst the private side will have to do more on personal accountability, I think in each society, the government can plan better on the social side, the social aspect of it. Not so much as in the welfare, but in the whole infrastructure planning. From retirement villages to living smaller but better. Small doesn't have to be inconvenient. It can be very good.
Right.
So housing planning, public transport, having proper medical care that need not be hospitalized but can be done, provided at home, affordable, accessible, 24 hours a day. So I think in Asia, for retirement, that planning takes more than just funding, but it takes fundamentally a rewiring of the way we look at the social adjustment for an aging population. And secondly, coming from Singapore, about 30% of Singaporeans are migrants anyways. We import them readily because if fertility or birth is low, then you have to import the right talent. And so you get on going with it from indigenous Singaporeans, I think it's about 3.2 million of us, but our population is 5.6. So society gets on, it attracts a lot of talent, it is multicultural, it has spruced up more Michelin-star restaurants than ever before. So it's been vibrant. So I think there needs to be a fair bit of social engineering in the right way to bring about changes.
There's a wonderful book by two authors at the London Business School entitled The 100-Year Life. And if you look at teenagers, my children are all teenagers, they have a 60% probability to live to 105 or greater. So the way we think about longevity has radically changed, and that goes back to the workforce human skill set. It's not just skilling someone for their first job, but throughout their life. Oka-san, let me come to you and pull these two issues together. How you think about infrastructure, and also you're in a country which demographics present a huge challenge and maybe some opportunities. How, from your perspective, do you manage and bank through the demographic challenges, and how do you address some of the infrastructure issues?
Aging and shrinking population. So I'd like to say about some kind of cooperatives and sustainability. Is that all right? So I believe there are many other experts who discuss sustainability much more comprehensively and much more depth than I'm able to. But I would like to say the Norinchukin Bank is rooted to agriculture and fishery and forest cooperatives. And the concept of sustainability had a lot in common with our sustainability has a lot of common with our organizational management. So that is cooperatives are formed and run in the spirit of mutual assistance, all for one, one for all. So the purpose of the many cooperatives is to provide an exit from poverty, and the members encouraged to help each other, and learn through the education and the welfare services provided by the cooperatives. So many of the activities at cooperatives match with many of SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals set by the United Nations. So in the primary industry, we and you work with nature, and we have perceived climate change as an accepted outcome. So, however, in today's world, we understand better that as caring initiatives are vital for our own business. Slowly but steadily, we are making progress to move on to the power of cooperatives, such as environmentally friendly agriculture. That means organic farming and planting cover crops and applying compost, and resource managed fishery. That means bringing up the small fry, stocking and managing the fish population, and sustainable forestry. That's a circulation of planting and bringing up and logging and replanting. So as part of corporate network that supports the primary industry, Norin Chukin Bank supports the these members' effort. Yes, and the main role of Norin Chukin Bank is to manage the deposit from the farmers and cooperatives. So we manage to the deposits to globally diversified investment. So as a financial institution, we support the Equator Principle and TCFD recommendations, and we have started working on ESG investments. From the perspectives of investing in Asia and the Pacific region, project finance and renewable energy would also our target. So looking further forward, I hope to help sustainable development in Asia or Africa. So by introducing a Japanese cooperative system, which helps members mutually, and operates agriculture in an environmentally friendly manner. So we help each other, with senior by the activity of our cooperatives in the region and shrinking population.
Great, that's a nice way to segue into a very important issue on ESG. And I just want to remind the audience, I am taking questions from you. Just if you'll use your app, it'll come up to me and I'll see it here on this screen, and I'll make sure and fold those questions into the conversation. As I said in my opening remarks this morning, you may or may not have been here, the sustainable agenda, the green finance agenda has really taken off. Just at the IF, I would say 18 months ago, we rarely talked about it. Now I can't hire enough staff to keep up on the issues. Obviously transforming the way we think about financing projects and how we think about projects. And some of it is demographically driven. We have a millennial generation that is very environmentally conscious. Maybe Don, and we'll run down, maybe you give us a sense of how you see ESG generally in the region, but how's the region thinking about environmental sustainability? And then I'll rope in the rest of you.
Okay. So I think it's fair to say that sustainability has become a much bigger, more developed investment discussion in Europe than in Asia, but Asia's coming on pretty quickly now. At Eastspring covers, we have presence in 11 markets in the region where we have our main operations. We have some sales offices in Europe and US, but we're really an Asia-focused organization, but we cover from Japan and Korea to Indonesia and Vietnam. So your view of being sustained can change a lot depending on where you're starting from.
Correct.
If you're making $2 a day, the last thing you want is to be sustained at $2 a day.
Right.
And I think it's important when we talk about sustainability from a European dimension, we're often thinking green, and Axel Weber this morning talked about the Green Party in Germany and what, it's very much really from an environment focus, and can we see a developed world that is sustainable environmentally, I would argue. There are other aspects to it, but that's the heart of a big part of the passion. When you're looking at the Sustainable Development Goals in their totality, all 17 of them, there's an awful lot of them that are looking at it from the $1 a day, $2 a day, anti-poverty, basic health care, basic education, and bringing the developing world, the least developed world, up to standards of middle and higher income. So how to approach sustainability to deal with all those objectives is the challenge that Asia faces. And so I would say from our perspective, so Eastspring has signed on, we're a signatory to the PRI and a number of other climate initiatives. We have put ESG processes into all our investment processes. And where we see it as an opportunity, but we're trying to be sure that we're integrating this with the full range of development objectives. So you're in the local economy, either as an insurance provider or as an asset manager, you're looking to work with governments on the full range of things like building out the capital markets. We do a lot of work on building up education systems, financial literacy, and things about resilience. So it's a full-scale effort, but to deal with not only the greening, but also the growing.
I think you raise a good point about the challenge of the green agenda being potentially anti-growth. If it's about taking us back or not sustaining rapid growth, especially in this part of the world, given the demographics we just talked about, then it may lose favor among certain political circles. Ed, UBS is a world leader on sustainability. Certainly Axel's made it a priority. How do you see it from your perspective?
It's tough, but first, before I get to that, I think Asia has made fantastic progress the last 3 years. Because when you're poor, living out in a palm oil plantation, etc., and the fastest way for fertilizing the land is to graze the whole thing, you do it. Because you don't even sleep on the mattress, you're hungry. So, and somehow when you get into the mindset, you say, well, if you remember London, it was stuck in smog anyways. So they've done their part, now it's my turn to develop that way. That's the mindset. And to overcome that mindset as bankers, you do two things, right? Either you educate or you take the easiest way, which is to cut them off. And if you cut them off, it's like mercury, they just run up somewhere else. So the educational process, the 3 years, I have personally seen a lot of commitment and improvement. And the key thing is to tell them that it is actually very profitable to be sustainable. And I think you're seeing a lot of social movement in Asia where enough is enough. If you look at the smog and the haze. In Singapore, September is the month for F1 where the world visits Singapore. And mostly in September, you get the haze. So we have to reach out to our friendly neighbor and say, try not to do it. If you have to do it, maybe another month where the wind is blowing south. It's been tough, but I see a lot of improvement. For UBS, we are doing a few things. In the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2017, we made a commitment to raise at least $5 billion in impact investment over 5 years. As of end of last year, we have done $1.9 billion. We also believe in transition to low carbon economy. We have reduced carbon-related assets to $2.7 billion from end of last year, down from 6.6 a year earlier. And also climate-related sustainable investment increased to $87.5 billion US dollars from $74 billion in 2017. So it's moving towards the direction. Sustainable green storage energy, putting children to education, LGBT, women at work. These are all very passionate topics in Asia right now. And I think Asia is accelerating. And I have to thank one thing which you brought up just now, which is the advancement of the internet and communication. That has actually lent a lot of educational forum and platform to actually move industrialists as well as the social effort towards the ESG effort in Asia. As a nation, I have to say I've never seen more progress than the last 3 years. And also bankers as well have a lot of role to play. Green up or we're going to drop you.
So, Toby, you want to jump in on this,
Yes.
and then I'll come to you.
I just want to add to what Edmund just said, and also addressing earlier questions regarding, we see the cycle that an economy moving from agriculture to manufacturing to eventually to service industry much faster. That pace has gotten much faster given the development in technology, people are much more connectedness to the internet and information, and also another pace that we have seen has gotten much faster is the awareness of the environment, awareness of social issues in relation to the stage of development. The country like Vietnam or the Greater Mekong region has started talking about that even before, they've gotten to the typical stage of development when the policymakers start talking about the green initiatives and all of that, which I think is extremely a good sign and also has been helped, as Edmund mentioned before, through the information flow of the internet. People start talking, having debates, and also I want to say that not all technology. There's a lot of technology development that actually help with the social goods, and we not necessarily have to make a choice, make a trade-off between green or growing. And one example is using AI to bring education to much more marginalized group of society, and also using the kind of technology or AI technology, computer vision to help with insurance, weather insurance to help with the farmers, reaching out to better financial access with alternative data source. A lot of this can be done giving full awareness of the the green environment, helping with the poor, and bridging the gap between social divide.
Wonderful. Ben, I was in your offices, your headquarters in February. We had a long discussion about ESG generally and sustaining green finance. How do you see it from Macquarie?
Well, I certainly think that ESG, which wasn't really talked about broadly and in mainstream 3 years ago, is now the hot topic. And that's a great thing. The fact that investors want to get good returns, but also they want to do it in a way where they can feel good about it and it has the right impact is, I think, a really good development for the industry. And so I think what we're seeing across the region is both a shift in investment policy but also regulation, which is holding everyone to a higher standard, and that is starting to catalyse change. I think the one thing we've got to be a little bit careful about is if you spend any time in Asia with the communities who are now being pulled out of poverty and live on $2.20 a day, they're not declaring victory. So there is still a very long way to go in large parts of our region where they don't have the right water infrastructure yet, where young girls do not have access to education, where the notion of diversity and inclusion is merely just words and certainly doesn't play out in everyday business or family life. So I think it is a long journey that we're on, and I think we need to be a little bit careful about patting ourselves on the back. While it's great we've seen the largest movement of people in Asia out of poverty in the history of the world over the last 10 years, there is a long way to go. But I think, as Oka-san pointed out, there are lots of institutions across the region who this wasn't a key agenda item for 10 years ago, even 2 years ago, who are now embracing that and catalysing that change. And, you're just seeing that through the investment opportunities opening up. So green energy is probably the best example where, 80% of the world's green energy investment was made in Asia over the last 2 years. And the impact that's starting to have on, say, things like the environment in places like India and China, and in some parts of ASEAN, are very material. It's material to everyday people's lives. But what it's also proving is that actually we can live in a decarbonising or non-carbon world and still have the same, if not a better, standard of living using things like technology and the adoption of new sorts of forms of energy. And that, I think, is really encouraging, and that's now cascading, I think, through the region.
Yeah. So do you worry about consistency in regulation, but regulation that may be formulated in Washington or London or Paris that really isn't applicable to the region because of the differences in living standards?
I mean, I think if you go to, so I think Don made the point before, if you're operating in 11 or 12 markets in the region, it's likely that 50% of your markets are going to be developing markets. And when you go to a developing market, you sit down with the Minister of Coal, who, it's not the world's sexiest title, but that's a serious job in an emerging market, and you say to them, all right, no more coal for you. They don't respond with a big cheery smile. They're like, well, that means that 500 million people in my country will not have access to electricity. So I get your point that it's not great for the environment, but equally I'm a politician and I want people to be able to boil the water in their homes or have a shower. So take me through how you're going to help me fix that algorithm. And that's what I think we need to have more focus on, is that if people didn't need to use coal, they wouldn't use coal. But at the moment, while it's cheaper and it allows for whole communities to be electrified and is also an enabler of growth, until we create opportunities for them that help solve that and therefore solve broader regional and global problems, it's difficult just to make sort of decisions from on high from other regions that really don't take into account the nuance of where that country is from a development point.
And that's a great point. That's a message that we need as an industry representative. We need to deliver to those authorities making those decisions. And it really is about transition. It can't be binary. You're either green or you're brown. But how do you get from brown to green? And it may take a number of years. And how do you build in those incentives or disincentives?
Well, I think in being solutions oriented, so it doesn't help to just say no, right? Then what? There is a ministry of, they have projects, you have to give, there has to be an alternative. And it has to be an alternative that comes with the capacity to deliver it. So a lot of the work that needs to be done by not just our industry, but with the multilateral development banks, I think there's a lot of goodwill across the region that you see to build the capability to do renewable power better, to manage grids so they can manage a distributed system, right? For personal, by households or businesses to sell back into the grid. So that's there, the will to do that is there, it just has, the means to do that needs to be, we need to facilitate that. Can I mention two other areas, kind of different spectrums of ESG, just to kind of throw in a couple of things. So one, I was here a few months ago. There was Milken had a conference here, and it was corporate governance, and ESG was a big topic there. And it seems that generally speaking in our industry, when we talk about ESG, we're talking about corporate finance, corporate behavior, corporate equities, corporate bonds. But government bonds are a very big part of the global financial asset allocation. 49 trillion, there are various numbers out there, but it's a significant part of every global asset allocator's portfolio. So I've recently been interested, our multi-asset team has worked on, I think shortly we'll release an ESG tool that evaluates equally E, S, and G on a spectrum of government bonds across the world that are investable universe. It's not every country, because a lot of countries don't have real government bond markets. So that, and not only scores based on current status, how do you rank today, which of course would favor the developed countries, but on improvement. So that countries at the developing end of the spectrum that are making strides in E, S, or G can be recognized for having good policies and making an effort. So it's just something I'll mention. There are things I think our industry can do, because governments, if you think about allocating of finance, they're the ones that are setting the frameworks and the policies in the country to change the future trajectory of any social issue, whether that's education or its environment. So that's one thing I'll mention. On the other end of the spectrum, and this goes back and maybe you can comment, I had a chance to share some information in ASEAN recently to some policymakers around the spending on tech venture capital around the ASEAN region. Now, Singapore, as far as I can tell, is now #1 in the world in terms of per capita spending, somewhere around $1,300 per person on tech venture capital investment. So there's plenty of capital there to back good ideas. The rest of ASEAN, excluding Singapore, is about $10. $1,300, $10 per capita. There's a massive digital divide in terms of venture tech funding that's available. And so this is something, if we look at, what's the future of catching up, so to speak, for the economies that are lagging, that needs to be addressed. So there are a whole range of issues, but that's one where the financial system at this moment still needs rapid improvement and development in the developing economies.
And it's a great point, and I applaud Singapore and the MAS and Robbie Menon and his leadership there. They've done a remarkable job. We are a knowledge partner with them with respect to the FinTech Festival they put on every November. And we sat down with Robbie 4 years ago. We were wondering whether we could get 1,000 people to show up to the conference. They now have 30,000, 25, 30, 40,000 people show up. It's the largest conference. They take up the expo center out next to the airport. It really has been a transformation. It's the largest in the world. It's been a transformation in the region. You're certainly at the forefront of this. You're an expert on AI.
I was
How
there.
are you seeing technology evolve in the region and then AI specifically? We talk a lot about AI throughout the year. It's almost as hotter than ESG. So what is your perspective?
Well, just to respond to the earlier comment, I think a lot of money is pouring into tech industry across different economies. But I think the problem is we can't seem to find good enough projects. And a lot of them go to Singapore because they have the ecosystem, they have the environment, they have the support to bring these supposedly local company to become much more international. So in a way, the support, it's not so much about the amount of funds available, it's also amount of support and ecosystems that would bring up the level for this company. But in terms of the development of AI in Asia in general, I would like to carve out China in a way because it's the economy its own, and possibly Japan. But I would like to say that we are only seeing the adoption of use cases for AI mostly in high-tech industry, telecom, and financial services mostly in this part of the world. And I would expect to see a lot more on agriculture and manufacturing going forward. My concern is we would expect to see the trend that we have observed in the US, that a lot of the big company who can accumulate data, consumer data, and technical talents will accumulate most of the wealth, and that trend would be replicated here in Asia. So that would be something the regulator should look out for.
I think that's a great point because the level of innovation occurring in Asia around, I suppose, the app and digital economy, I think is often misrepresented or even not talked about, particularly in sort of Western media. And if you think about it, the Chinese mobile payments is 240 times bigger than that of the US.
Right.
Is that ever talked about on CNBC? No. But do we talk about these companies just copying other companies? Yes. Is that true? Well, every company copies each other, frankly. But a lot of it is the fact that these are genuinely innovative companies. And we did this interesting experiment at work where we had sort of 15 different things you could use using your smartphone. And so in each different office, someone in Jakarta, someone in Singapore, someone in Sydney, someone in Hong Kong, someone in Mumbai, and someone in Beijing all did, and everyone had the same 15 tasks: buy an insurance policy, book a sports class, book a restaurant, all these sorts of things. It was much easier and much quicker to do it in Mumbai or Beijing or Singapore than it was to do it in places like Sydney and Hong Kong. And that's where just the access, the adoption, the actual menu of things you can do is really leaving the world behind. And you just think about it from, I suppose, Don, from an insurance point of view, the way you buy insurance, the way you use insurance in a lot of markets like China, India, is much more technology enabled than in the traditional big Western economies. And I think that is what's exciting about this region, not just the scalability, but also the level of innovation that's coming through, which is indigenous often.
It's different because you never had credit cards or much money, so you don't have a wallet. And if somebody say, I pay you via your phone, you take it readily. So the adoption is much better. For Singapore, it's gone back to basic, which is blockchain. B as in blockchain, A, artificial intelligence, S as in cybersecurity, R, Internet of Things, C is in cloud. So right now it's looking extensively into 5G. And the application of 5G, which is much more electrified, much faster, from driverless car application to pharmaceutical, to healthcare. So the 5G application, it's far, in the tighter bandwidth, is actually generating much faster speed. So it is really up to your imagination how you want to use it. And some may even say, let's look at 6G right now. So I'm for one, would be very, very interested in 5G, and it's going to have a huge impact on ESG, on the workforce, on productivity, and even on the whole culture of finance. It's going to be a big change.
I'm glad you raised 5G. Obviously, the company Huawei is caught up in this tension between the U.S. and China, and then obviously there's some European countries that are sort of somewhere in between. Do you worry about this skirmish between the U.S. and China potentially undermining the 5G rollout either here or other parts of the world?
Yeah, of course. But if you talk about securities on the 5G technology or with any application on high tech, it's not necessarily the manufacturer that could actually put the spyware. It could be any, along the truncation, any part of it. And because the ownership is so opaque, anybody could say anything, anybody could implant anything. It's kind of difficult to take ownership of it. So you can have the best encryption technology, but you know they are going to hack it anyways.
Right.
So I guess the key element there is just trust. And trust is difficult in today's environment because the world never had two powers. It's always been one domineering force. So for China to come up that quickly, of course, is quite disruptive. I don't necessarily disagree that it needs more time for China to digest some of its development, to contribute to the world better. But the methods in pushing China back is maybe a bit too draconian, I would say, too fast, too unsophisticated. There are many better ways to do it. But I think China's role, if you have been to Shenzhen and Qianhai and their Silicon Valley, may not be as good as Silicon Valley in the Bay Area, but certainly in terms of adoption of usage, it's much faster. It's very, very different.
I'm glad you mentioned Silicon Valley. Whenever I get very depressed about the politics in Washington, I fly to the West Coast. I spent a couple of days in Palo Alto. I love the energy, the excitement. The people there have this sense that anything can be done, will be done. IOSD, one of our sponsors, was a very smart AI firm, is one representative of that mindset. Where is the Silicon Valley of ASEAN or Asia outside of China? And if it doesn't exist, what is the enabling environment? What do we have to see in order to see domestic innovation really flourish here rather than purchasing Chinese or U.S. Developed technology? Anyone?
It's sandbox, so you can afford to fall without hurting yourself. It's as much as the public or practitioners wanting it as the society will enable it through whatever government policies you have. It's tough because it's a solution for an aging population because it enables greater productivity to come on stream. So a lot of people are worried that technology will displace the labor force. I don't think so. Human beings are very nimble. And with the aging population, technology will enable higher productivity. My mom is 90. She plays Sudoku on her iPad. I'm serious. She calls me via WhatsApp on video because I travel all the time to talk to me. She's 90 years old. I mean, you would have thought that, a phone would do. So I think in Asia, careful with Asia, because the workforce in Asia is far more advanced exactly because of technology than the world will make it out to be. It is a very potent force to be reckoned with 25, 30 years from now.
Well, let me ask the question in a different way. In our closing minute, you're all purchasers of technology. Do you feel like the amount of money you're spending, that you know what you're getting something for it? A lot of our member firm CEOs say, look, we're spending billions, tens of billions. We're not sure what we're getting, but we know we need to spend it because there's a technology arms race. Do you feel comfortable? And is there enough locally grown innovation that would make you less reliant on a Huawei or a U.S.-based institution that may become unavailable to you if there are tensions? Again, what thoughts, anyone?
Listen, I think let's all be very pragmatic here in this conference. If there was a ban on Huawei, I can't use Huawei because it's an international tool that I need to use. I'm banking. So let's be quite upfront about that. There's no need to, to be diplomatically correct or politically correct. It is a fact. It is what it is. But I use a Huawei phone privately, and I can tell you, the camera works much better than an iPhone.
It does. Yeah. It's a great camera. I agree.
No, it is a great phone. It truly is, the Android compared to iOS. And the advancement is really fast. So I personally think that hopefully there will be a truce. Hopefully the world is in a better place at some point in time. I'm still optimistic that there will be one, but look out for the Taiwan election next year. It's going to rock a bit of world politics, but we'll see how it goes.
We're out of time. Any other closing thoughts on this
I
issue?
think there
Please.
are centers now of innovation. I mean, please speak to Thailand. Thailand for sure. Singapore, Jakarta. I think you see it happening around the region. India and China are probably at another level. India is extraordinary in terms of its innovation in digital applications. I think just to distinguish a couple of different things in your question. One is around true technology, big-scale innovative AI and 5G. I mean, I think Europe, US, China are probably going to be ahead in that for a while. But the application of digital technology, which is many of the things that Ben was referring to, and that's happening all over the region, is extraordinary. And the talent that's being put, I mean, you go to any of the countries we've talked about in this, you see some extraordinary good things happening that are changing the way people work, the way people spend, the way they play, everything aspect of life. So I do think that flexibility of the Asian workforce is showing through, and we certainly see it in the way we interact in the region.
I think just very quickly, I would like to give an analogy of all of these tech companies that give you a Lego bricks. The application of how you want to build it's up to the imagination of the local companies. So basically, I think innovation can happen in much smaller scale, but much more widespread and more localized.
With that, the final word. Thank you all for coming here today. Ladies and gentlemen, please give him a round of applause.